Thanks for listening to the Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast. We hope that you find the conversations to be helpful and enlightening as you get to hear from those involved in the Evangelical Friends movement. Be sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss when a new episode comes out. Now, enjoy the episode.
All right, everybody, welcome to the July episode of Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast. And I just want to say right off the bat, it's July, which means if you are in Northwest Yearly Meeting, we have our annual sessions coming up here in a few weeks, depending on when you're listening to this. So July, let me get the dates right here. July
21st through the 24th.
Yeah, there you go. That's what I wanted to say, but I wanted to be correct. July 21st to the 24th at George Fox University. We're having our annual sessions. The theme is There is One Who Still Speaks to Our Condition. We kind of talked about that last month with Jim, with it being the 400th anniversary birthday of George Fox, and looking at that kind of stuff. We'll be using some of his teachings, I think, as some of the main sessions and things that were going on there. And as Jim mentioned, there is going to be a 400th birthday for George Fox. And so if you're in Oregon, Idaho, Washington area, or maybe if you're even far away and you're like, hey, I want to go to that, more power to you. But come on out to Newberg, Oregon, George Fox University for our annual sessions.
Yeah, and if you're listening, you have kids, they're doing the family camp again.
Did your kids do that last year?
No, we did not.
Oh, okay.
But so there is, if you're, from grades 1 to 6, there's a day camp, and there's like commuter and overnight options.
Mm-hmm.
And the lodgings with the parents. And then there are some like high schooler and middle school camps available as well.
Yeah, so bring the whole family. I think if you have more kids and things like that, they do a nice job of like capping you at a certain price. So, if you're like, dang, I have 4 kids and me and my wife, that's going to be a lot of money. They cap it, I believe, at a certain amount. So
yeah, I believe it's like
get a deal.
$900.
Yeah, if you have a significantly large family, you can kind of get a deal on that. So
yeah, so it's always I enjoy it primarily just for the connection piece of just like seeing people I haven't seen in a long time, because it's like, especially people from like Idaho or Washington that I don't get to see regularly, or even just like the Newberg area, or the churches that are close-ish, but I don't really ever get to see them. So I always enjoy that.
Yeah, it's a good time. So yeah, we'd love to, and Austin and I will be there. I know everyone wants to see us.
I know, right? I mean, I guess now people see us because you put this on YouTube now, right?
Yeah.
So, but you can come. I guess we could have like a lunch or breakfast.
Exactly. You could tell us what topic you want us to discuss on the podcast in future episodes.
Yeah, we're always we really need to get kind of like an email for like
suggestions
or yeah. Because we're always interested in content ideas. So
yes.
And speaking about content ideas, we're gonna, now that we've kind of put our like announcements to one side,
we did our plugs.
We're gonna be going into kind of the meat of our episode today, and it's a topic that I chose, and we don't have an interview, but I have been feeling something for a while now of just there's just been a cultural shift in Christianity and evangelicalism more broadly, and I just couldn't put my finger on it. I was like, there's just like something different. And I noticed this kind of starting out with my experience at Bible college. And this has been probably the last 15 years, where like the Bible college I went to was fairly conservative. Back in the day, they were known for like you couldn't, if you worked there or went to a student there, you couldn't drink there. There was no dancing. There was rules about there was like no TVs. There was rules about like the content that you could watch on TV. And there were like all these like rules, and we called it the quote unquote, the contract.
There you go.
But then what was interesting is that when like I was there, the contract sort of loosened. So, for example, like if you were in the seminary, you could drink, but if you were in the undergrad, you couldn't, even if you were like, you know, of age,
Yeah.
which caused a lot of consternation in the student body. There was, oh, another part of the quote unquote contract was like things like dress code and um, like if you're a man, you had to have your hair a certain length, or if you're a woman, you had to have like your clothes a certain length. And so there were all these like these behavioral rules that were kind of common that kind of like went by the wayside. But what was interesting, it was like still in like the student handbook. Like they
Oh, it
never
was
like
still there and they never
it was
changed
still
it.
there, so you could see it, but like it was not enforced
Yeah.
and nobody cared. I mean, I take that back. Certain things people cared about. So things like, you know, like sex and drugs and, alcohol, those were all still pretty intense. But
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, like it was pretty common. I know that Netflix was a thing that like when I was starting out, like people were getting Netflix, videos in the mail
Yes.
back in the
Back
disc
in the
days.
day.
Um, and then it went to streaming and like we just like watched all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, and then I've noticed like churches just generally relaxing on things like their policies around alcohol, where it was like pretty normal. Like when I started going to attend church, that you would like having alcohol at a you know at a church function, like that, like, or a parachurch function, like you know going to a deacon's house, or going to your youth leader's house, like you would never see alcohol, and now it's pretty common that you see it. And this is just kind of like a broad trend that I've noticed. Like, and I mean, I even like heard of a church where I'm from, I won't name names, but they, like, a part of their shtick is that they would bring alcohol to like church functions, like just straight up like bring like microbrew, like you know coolers of microbrews to hand out at like the church barbecue. And it was like really edgy, and I was like, I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah.
um like as a pastor, I was like, I had all these concerns, and I've just noticed this, and just noticed like people's, like, particularly with alcohol, but kind of in general. So I've like noticed this like shift in culture. And then there was like a recent article in like the past month or so, in Christianity Today, talking about this, calling the loosening of evangelicalism, and talking about how there's just been this cultural change that's been happening in evangelical circles about, around a lot of behavioral cultural norms, um, and just kind of like pointing it out. And it was kind of like, oh, this like articulates this thing that I've been feeling, and
Mm-hmm.
seeing it in both in friend circles and non-friend circles. And kind of want to just like talk about the rise in these things, and some of them good and some of them bad. Um and I know even like my friends who've been talking a lot about the use, like alcohol in general, and how churches used to be much more intense about their condemnation in the use of alcohol, and now it's becoming much more normalized, and like the pros and cons and all that stuff. And so I kind of wanted to bring that to the channel. And I know it's one of those things that maybe you've seen in your church, or maybe you've been thinking about and wanted to talk about it.
Yeah. I think too, it's also, I mean, I'll just say this right off the gate. I don't know, like this topic in general might be like, it might make some people like tense up. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Um, and so, yeah, I think it's good to talk about. Obviously, as Austin mentioned, it is happening. And so like, there are two things you can do with that. You can just like ignore it and be like, no, 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 or you can like look at it and talk about it. And so I think that's good. Like, obviously, some of these things this may be getting the cart before the horse, but people are going to come down on different sides on this. And so just like understanding that, and I think being respectful with people about where they're coming from and their background on things, and ultimately not everyone's going to fall on the same side on some of these things. And how do we navigate that and work together with people? But yeah, it's definitely like Austin mentioned, there's a bar up the street from my house that like a church, I guess a church plant or something. I don't know what the right word is. They don't have their own building. And, like a lot of times you hear churches maybe rent out coffee shops and do their church services there. Well, this church rents out a bar and
All
they
right.
just have their church service at this bar. I've never been, but I'm like, that's interesting to me. One, they're doing something different. There's a million other churches that meet at coffee shops. And so maybe they're like, we're going to try something new to try to reach a different crowd. I don't know. But it definitely catches my attention when I drive by there. I think they meet on Mondays. So every now and then when I'm driving by on a Monday evening and see them there, I'm like, that is interesting. And they have people there.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to like depending on your background with this, that you might cheer,
Yeah.
being like that's like meeting people where they're at, and like you know, but then there's probably some other people in our audience who are probably cringing when you say that,
Yeah.
because you're just like because of this some of these cultural issues, and so I just kind of wanted to and I think the one that I had in my mind that he kind of talks about in his article. And if you're interested, it's by Brad East, and it's called The
Yeah.
Loosening of Evangelicalism.
I'll put
It's a
the
good
link in the description.
it's a good piece, but he brings up the particularly the use of alcohol in and tattoos, or like the two kind of categories that he chooses. And it was something that I've noticed is the relationship with the church and alcohol in the last 15 years has really changed, but it's not ever been something that I felt like was like planned or generally agreed upon, and like he talks about this, that was or intentional per se, but it has just become like the thing. And and kind of like why is that, like why, and kind of he puts out his theories, because he sensed this and I sensed this, and so there's kind of like theories around like why this is the case. And and in at least with like the topic of alcohol, like I know that like Friends historically have been very they have been known as teetotalers and abstainers from alcohol. And if you look at like most kind of faith and practices in the last, I mean, that was made not recently, in like the past like 20 years, um there is a pretty strong condemnation of alcohol. Like oh, I don't have like I think even in the queries for a Northeast Yearly meeting, they talk about, do you use alcohol? And with the assumption that alcohol is bad and you shouldn't do it, and um, you shouldn't drink. And I do think that there is this thing that our culture has generally become very much more. And this is one of his theories, is that as culture has shifted to being much more permissive on lots of things, including alcohol, it's caused a strain in church. Um,
I just wanted to
essentially,
say this before you got too far away. I found it.
yeah.
So this is in the Northwest Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice, Query 16. Do you discipline your mind and body to serve as an instrument of the Lord? Do you avoid pornography? Do you abstain from harmful, addictive, and unnecessary drugs, including alcoholic beverages, tobacco, marijuana, and cocaine, and from profiting through their use? Do you refrain from gambling and taking part in lotteries?
Which is something like, I mean, at least here in Oregon, that would be very countercultural, right?
Sure. Yeah. The
Like
marijuana and tobacco, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
marijuana, tobacco, and alcohol. I mean, like Oregon is known as like the craft brew state of the
Mm-hmm.
nation. And I think Portland has
Marijuana is
more.
legal.
Yeah. And so to like, and even during the pandemic, this was like mind-boggling to me. And I mean, this is going to maybe be ruffle some feathers, but I remember how they were so quick to close schools, but they were so open to keeping bars and breweries open that they changed a law here in Oregon to make it legal to take alcohol like home with you from a restaurant. Like you could like order
Oh yeah. They did
like you
that in
could
Idaho too. You could order stuff to go and just they would put it in like pre-sealed bottles and give it to you.
yeah, like you could order like cocktails to go. And I was
Mm,
just like, what? Like I was like, what are the priorities here?
yeah.
Um and I mean, and so that's like a political question, and I don't want to like kind of derail that. It all I'm the point of that reference was to say how in our culture, at least here in
Yeah.
Oregon,
The culture has gone a different way.
the culture is very supportive of alcohol and alcohol use, and it's even like in our memes. Like if an internet culture, like during the pandemic, it was you know there's all these jokes around like daytime drinking and mommy juice, and which is like
Wine.
wine,
Mhm.
for those who are uninitiated, um that it was just like, oh yeah, it's really cool, like I'm gonna have my mommy juice at 2 o'clock, and you're just like, and you're like, okay. And so the culture got really permissive about this. However, the dark side to all of this has been a rise in alcoholism, um that is kind of been a consequence. Um and so that like I wonder if there is a dark side to this for the church, that
Mm.
and specifically Brad East in his article talks about that when culture becomes more permissive about something, and it makes a much more, because maybe in the past it was much more common not to drink,
Yeah.
but now because the culture is so permissive of drinking and so supportive of drinking and so supportive of alcohol, culturally speaking, to not drink alcohol or not to be supportive of alcohol puts Christians in a kind of a spot where it makes you more distinctive, and it makes it so then you have to be more intentional about you know if we're going to do this or not,
Why you
and
don't. Yeah.
why you don't, and is this a market discipleship. And then for a lot of evangelicals, the question comes down to scripture, right? Like,
Hmm.
does scripture condone this or not?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing. He kind of wraps it up, and we talked about this before, but that's kind of where he comes down on some of these things is basically, and I'll read this if I can find it. But yeah, saying like he has some points at the end, but basically as our culture becomes less Christian and more secular, it creates new incentives on us as believers to like basically explain your stance on certain things. Whereas, like decades ago, when drinking wasn't as culturally accepted, I mean, for sure, there was even prohibition where it wasn't even allowed for a while. It's like culturally, drinking just wasn't as big of a thing. And so, as not drinking, you didn't stand out. Now you kind of stand out. So it says if everyone in the non Christian majority believes or does a certain thing, let's just say drinking for this example, it becomes a conspicuous sign of Christian discipleship to continue abstaining from it. And so this leads all believers and pastors to reconsider their commitments. And then he kind of uses the examples and these thoughts of like, is alcohol forbidden by God? Is it in black and white? Is there a specific chapter and verse you can point to? If not, then many people may begin to wonder, why am I suffering my coworkers and neighbors' scorn when there's not black and white instruction to not do certain things? And so then that's kind of where you kind of get into this situation, I guess, that we're in now. And so, yeah, like when looking to scripture, we can find black and white instruction on certain things, but some of these things, yeah, it's like, I mean, I think of Romans 14, where it's, or even verses, this may be Romans 14 too, where like everything is permissible, but not everything's beneficial.
I think it's Corinthians.
Yeah. But then in Romans 14, for sure, he's talking about like people who have different views on certain things. And one is like eating meat, and one is like considering one day more sacred than another. And basically, he says like, or I'll just read this. Um, One person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak only eats vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. Basically, each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind Whoever eats meat so does to the Lord, and they give thanks to God, and whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. So this passage doesn't mention alcohol specifically in here, but I think a lot of people use this passage and to kind of look at topics like this and saying, like, if there's no explicit instruction on something, yay or nay, then you kind of have to come to your own, like, not your own, but I guess like if you approach God and through prayer and discernment, like you come up with your own, like I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do this, and you've made peace with that with God, then that's what you've decided. But someone else may come to a different conclusion, and then you have to be able to walk in agreement with that with those people. And it talks too about like if so say for example, if I say drinking alcohol is okay and Austin doesn't, then like, okay, I shouldn't drink alcohol when I'm hanging out with Austin, as to not like cause him any temptation or any, just not to be an issue to him. And I
Yeah.
think that's where maybe some people don't go to that next step. They say like, well, it doesn't say I can't drink alcohol in the Bible, and so I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
But then you don't go to that next step and be like, okay, but I shouldn't do it in front of these people for X, Y, Z reasons.
But there's lots of things in the Bible. I'm just gonna kind of push back because
Sure, sure.
maybe I'll kind of like I have kind of like a personal conflict around alcohol because like on one hand I can totally see like it like you can be a you can drink responsibly and it's fine. But on the other hand, I definitely see how alcohol destroys people
Mm,
because I've like seen a lot of like my I have family members who are alcoholics.
yeah.
And like for me, when I was growing up, like one of the things that was so powerful a witness to me personally when I like first became a Christian was that the church was a safe place because I knew that people weren't drinking. Like people were sober, and so I never had to feel tense in those
Mm,
environments. Like I knew it was like when I would come to a church function that like I knew it was if I went to like a small group or like I knew that like if these people were safe in terms of when it like came to alcohol. And I do think that there is a um are you familiar with this is kind of are you familiar with Chesterton's fence? Do you know what this is?
no.
Okay, so Chesterton's fence. So G.K. Chesterton, philosopher thinker, he said that like in one of the arguments of of being against this is like, oh, that's old fashioned, and oh, like we know better, and in relooking at like cultural taboos, like Chesterton says, like rather than tearing down the fence right away because you don't think it has a purpose anymore, maybe investigate why they put the fence there in the first place
Mm,
rather than just tear it down. And that because you never know what the fence was for.
yeah.
And so like maybe the fence was put there and it was silly, but maybe the fence was put there because it's like keeping in a like dangerous animal that and trying to keep people safe, right?
Yeah.
Um and like I know that there is I think some wisdom in the ages because it's like I like you just click on, um if you look up being sober in the Bible, there's lots of verses around being sober minded, not being drunk, not being like one of the categories of being an elder is like that you aren't, you're not an alcoholic. And, First Peter, be sober minded, be watchful, for your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion. Uh, be self-controlled and sober-minded. Again, First Peter, Thessalonians. Then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. Um, Ephesians, do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. Titus, older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-control. Right? Like like there is a lot of verses in the Bible that even though it doesn't directly condemn the use of alcohol, right? Because we can think of counterexamples like Paul telling Timothy to drink wine, or
Sure,
Jesus
sure.
or Jesus himself making,
Providing the wine.
wine at a party
Yeah.
and at a wedding. It's like one of his like first miracles.
Yeah.
Um, but there's lots of examples in the Bible that alcohol isn't a positive thing either.
Oh, sure.
Like I'm thinking of like Noah, right? Or there's lots of characters that get drunk and bad things happen. And oftentimes in the biblical story, just because it doesn't condemn something doesn't mean it's not condemning it.
Yeah.
Like the issue of slavery, for example. The Bible never flat out says that slavery is evil, but there's lots of verses that make it clear that God's not pro-slavery,
Sure.
right? Um, and so I do think that there is this interesting fact where you're just like, well, if we don't know, maybe it is better to err on the side of being more conservative and old school.
Mm.
Because and what's interesting, and I don't know if you've seen this, is that at least in the internet circles that I'm coming across, there is a big movement of becoming sober again. I don't know if you've like
Yes.
noticed this.
Yeah, I have actually my aunt and uncle, I don't know their full story of why they're choosing to do this, but they both used to like drink pretty like heavily. I mean, I wouldn't say they were drunk, but they would drink regularly, recreationally. And like probably about a year ago, they both just like were like posting all the time about like we're sober, we're not drinking anymore. And they actually recently just started a non-alcoholic beer company, which that's also a big thing that's rising up. Like there's a lot of these non-alcoholic wines and non-alcoholic beers, like for people who, say like, I just like the taste of beer, but I don't want to like be drinking anymore, which I don't understand that because I don't like the taste of beer. But like that's a huge market share that's rising right now. Like you can go to the store and there will most likely be like a good sampling of non-alcoholic wines and beers and stuff, which didn't used to be there anymore. And so, yeah, that is a like a rising group right now who are being like, I don't want to drink anymore. I want to be sober.
Well, yeah, it's like I mean, so I've looked this up. The largest market, the largest growing market share in the alcohol space is the non-alcoholic spirits
Yeah.
in drinks. So, and it is kind of, and I've seen it fueled by like people kind of like Jordan Peterson and kind of like the people that are kind of around him that are, calling men to be, better, healthier. Um, I see this a lot in the fitness space. There's a lot of
Yep.
fitness influencers who are being like, you need to be sober for like health reasons. And so I do think it's interesting that even in culture, there is kind of this like backlash. And what
Push
I think
back
is
on it.
there's pushback on it. And what I think is interesting is that in the church, that there's no longer this like sense of like where we're at, right?
Mm.
Like we've just kind of like moved along with culture and we haven't really articulated it. And I think one of the challenges is, and this is like he brings this up, is just like we don't have like thick what do you call it? Thick identities anymore.
Yeah.
That like, for example, I feel like Quakers used to have a very thick identity around like we are Quaker, we are friends, you
Here's what that
know,
means.
this is what this means, this is what it looks like, these are the behaviors that we do. And there was a lot of like, a lot of scorn and a lot of pushback, but like there was like it was a pretty tight community. And
Hmm.
nowadays it's like I just don't see that. I don't see that we have a very thick identity anymore. And
Well, even just Christianity across the board, like even within other denominations, I feel like that's the case. There's a lot of splintering over certain issues, and for sure non-denominational churches have risen in the past 10, 20 years. And so yeah, there's just like every church on the corner can kind of do whatever they want. Yeah, there's no like binding denominational identities.
and then just the general lack of trust in church institutions, like, the kind of the privatization of faith. And just it's like it's just me and then in my conscience, and it doesn't matter what my community says, because ultimately I can go and choose whatever church that I want to. Or because like I think the other thing with like the kind of the loosening of our standards a little bit, or just kind of our cultural identity might be another way of saying this, is how there are people within the Christian circles that say contradicting, like say two opposing things,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So you might have like a really cool mega pastor, I mega church pastor who is like covered in tattoos and like drinks and is like, seems really cool and has a large following and has like some books. And so then they say something, and then you're like, your local church pastor will say another thing, and maybe not as charismatic, maybe not as polished, but yet like so then you have these two authorities,
Hmm.
right? And so then it's just like most people are just kind of going with what they're seeing on
With what they
Instagram,
prefer, or
what they
yeah,
prefer,
they're
and
like, I already felt that I shouldn't drink, so I'm gonna be in favor of this guy, or I already felt that drinking is okay, so I'm gonna be in favor of this guy. Yeah.
and then we struggle in our church communities, and then that puts like pastors like me kind of in an interesting position about like, well then like what do you do
Hmm.
where like people are coming and trying to be a part of my community or any faith community, but like the rules and the cultural norms might not be very important to those people anymore, and it kind of changes the kind of the experience of church as a whole.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, I don't even know where I was gonna go with that, but
And not to like, I think that this is part of like part of the this is alcohol is just one example of this,
sure.
like
Yeah.
because he in the article he brings up even like liturgical forms, right, of like evangelicals and low church Protestants for like decades were really like anything that smelled of Catholicism they would just like avoid, even quit like, and I would probably say even more so for friends. um
Mm, yeah.
and and now it's pretty common that you would like, I mean I do this, so it's like we have like I do like an Advent sermon series
Yeah.
every year,
Or like
which
Lent or something.
I did a fasting series during Lent
Yeah.
this past year, like, and that's just an example of how that's not quote unquote typical friends, but yet like it's become common
Yeah.
among
Within church.
in church, or even in yearly meeting. Maybe I'll put it another way, is we there was kind of a small controversy around
I
uh
was about to be like, I was thinking, should I mention this or not? But
around baptism and communion
yeah.
and using
So
those.
much so that the yearly meeting elders like put out a statement basically saying like, yeah, you can do baptism and communion, and here's what we would say about that. Yeah, I know that was a little bit of a controversy here in the Northwest. And I think that's always maybe been, I don't know. I remember the church that I grew up in was a Friends church in Texas. So, this was 20 years ago. I was still a high school student. Um, and we would get new families that would come in who weren't from the Friends background. And that was always kind of a sticking. I can think of one family in particular because their daughter was in high school with me too. So, like, I just got to know them a lot. And they would say to the pastor all the time, we love this church. We really love this church. We love the preaching. We love the youth group. We love everything about this church. We just wish you guys did communion.
Yeah,
Like,
I've had that conversation with an
and like
individual.
it didn't, it was just so funny. Like they would just list forever how much they love it. They love it. They love it. But if only you did communion, then you would be like the perfect church for us. And yeah, so I know that's probably some of maybe I don't know the full inner workings of why that happened at Northwest, but I can imagine that was happening at more and more churches. You're getting new members who are not from the Friends background, and they're used to things like communion and baptisms on a more regular basis. And yeah, maybe some of that tension and pressure from some of the pastors to be like, I don't know, we don't typically do that, but I don't want to upset people that are coming to my church and things like that.
Well, yeah, and that puts like a serious pressure, because I know for me it's like pressure to explain why we don't do something, right?
Hmm.
And to kind of defend this position because it is kind of a unique feature. and you could say this about like all sorts of, cultural norms within evangelicalism, or discipleship sort of practices that we might do, um, or in friends or outside of friends, that when you are distinctive, then you have to kind of make an apology for it. You have to make a
Yes.
defense for it, and you need to be generally more or less persuasive, especially for new members
Yes.
or people who are seeking. And so, and I remember I just having conversations with people, and um, I would not say I'm the most persuasive individual, and I found it very challenging to try to persuade people on that particular, to 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 move away from formalism and move towards kind of like a spiritualized understanding of these things. People just had a really big hang up for it, and I think that this would be true for lots of people, because it's like liturgical forms, or I think Paul Anderson calls it like lively formalism. So
Mm.
formalism that feels really dynamic and personal. So things like, because right, like I've had experiences in my life before I was a friend, um, having communion and having it being a really like powerful experience,
Mm.
like taking the elements and it being really, really powerful. And um which would be kind of like a lively formalism, right? That there's
Mm.
like something happening in that moment and that's unique. Um and I think for a lot of people that's the case. And so then when you have to make the case otherwise, it can be a hard sell.
Yeah.
And especially when the rest of Christianity does it, right?
Yeah.
And like that's a tension within, I think, friends or just any denomination, is like, how do you keep your like cultural identity but also still be biblical and create that kind of that identity?
Mm.
Because I think that's like a bit like kind of like underneath this is like, I think that there is like pragmatism about like, do we want to do this for like spiritual reasons? Is it biblical, right? Like we're not like adding things to scripture, but we're not taking things away from scripture. But then there's
Yes.
like, but then I think there's an identity part of it too, around like, this is just who we are and this is how we like do things.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think all of those things I think are important to consider. Um, but like, I do feel like because Christianity in general has been declining, I think that there has been this thing where it's like, well, if they're not our enemies, then we'll just kind of like adopt what they're doing because it's like we're better together.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, for lack of a better word, desperation.
Yeah, maybe not desperation, but like we have more in common with other denominations than we have less in common than with
Yeah.
like maybe the quote unquote world. And so
Yeah.
then it's like, so then those things aren't as important. But then it causes this kind of cultural problem where you're just like, everybody's reading, like it's not uncommon for a person to be like listening to a Catholic podcast, reading a
Mm-hmm.
Southern Baptist, like theology, read it, you know,
Or even
maybe,
just like even like books, like
yeah,
a lot of big authors, big Christian authors do come from a denominational bent, and
yeah,
so
definitely,
whether you realize that or not, when you're reading a book from I'm just thinking of names here, Matt Chandler, or you're reading a book from Beth Moore, or you're reading a book from these people, like they're kind of coming at certain things from a certain angle. And so whether you realize that or not, and then you're like, oh, okay, that's good. But then your church maybe doesn't do some of those things or doesn't hold the same position on some of those things because you're from a different denomination. That's where you kind of get, yeah, some of that tension. It's like, well, I just read a book that was had a different view on that, and but he's a Christian and I like him and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
well, and this is maybe kind of the question that I have, is like, how do you create thick communities, or like, how do you create like having this strong sense of identity and community as Christians and as a church? And one of the things I think you brought up, just a good one, is just simply like having publishing. and having
Mm.
books that are being read, and like having materials that are being produced and
Within your
read
community.
within your community to be read by your community.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I think that's kind of like, I think one of the sad things to me about yearly meeting right now is that we just don't have any sort of like publication arm. And I know there's like history there, and I
Sure.
don't want to drag up the past, but that is I think a challenge of retaining our identity as, evangelical friends, is that there's not like
Not a
an
lot of
evangel
material being produced in the
no,
evangelical friends world. Yeah.
no, there isn't.
Yeah.
And
So yeah, for most churches within our area, if you're going to use some kind of material for a Bible study or a small group or whatever, it's
children's
coming.
children's curriculum,
Yeah, it's coming from the Baptist world or the Methodist world or
the
whatever.
reformed world.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
we don't have our own stuff unless you want to read George Fox's journal or something as a Bible study, which, whatever. But yeah, it's like you
That
either
would
have
not
to
be a
go
Bible study.
hundreds of years back. Yeah, no, I mean a small group or whatever. Yeah, you either have to go back hundreds of years, or yeah, there's not much.
There isn't, and that like it's a challenge.
Yeah. Yep.
What do
Well,
you what I mean, I know that we're kind of wrapping up here,
yeah,
but
no, you're good.
what are maybe some of your ideas about how to like make, thicker communities in this moment?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me. I mean, I just keep coming back to, I don't know why. I mentioned it at the very beginning. I just keep thinking about that church that meets at a bar down the street from my house. And like, yeah, I think just picking or like defining whatever your parameters are and embracing to it and sticking to it and not, I don't know, that's the hard thing. I was going to say embracing to them and sticking to them and not giving on them, but then that's the hard thing in the sense of the thing we just mentioned earlier with like trying to welcome new people to your community that aren't from that kind of background. And you
Mm-hmm.
don't want to be like so hard and so rigid that you're not welcoming to them and
Yeah.
that they're not going to stick around. Um, so yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other thought I've just had is just simply like, I don't know if this is true for you, but just having like proximity, right? Like it's easier to have a thick identity when you're surrounded by people who are like you on a regular basis,
Mm,
right? That so it's like if we had um so for example, like in if you have like a say like a university, and then you have a church, and you have like you work and you live in your community, rather than kind of like you work online and you do things that like, and you just kind of surround yourself by people who are all kind of the same, it would kind of engender some of those things.
sure.
Because it's a lot easier to say. So for example, if you're in a community where the norm is you don't drink and you do things without drinking, you're more likely than not to not drink as well,
Hmm. Hmm.
even if you don't care about it. Like you're just like not going to do it, um, or pick your other sort of thing, right? I know that we've been hammering on
We've
the
been hammering
alcohol
on.
issue,
No,
but I
it's
think it's something that's like needing to be talked about. Like, and maybe that could be a whole other episode. It's just like alcohol,
hmm
because this one's just more about like the changing dynamics, like cultural dynamics and the norms that are happening in churches.
yeah.
But
I think to me, just to kind of close it out and wrap it up, I think kind of what I was hitting at before, I think just where I would want to leave it for people. We've mentioned the reality that culture is changing, culture is shifting, and so maybe years ago, people didn't drink as much, and so the church was more in line with that. Then recently, drinking has been more accepted, and maybe now people are falling in line with that. And then, as Austin just mentioned, now maybe there's this rise in sobriety, and so maybe the church will fall in line with that. I just feel like we people need to like have their conviction and not just fall in line and be
Yeah.
so willy-nilly with those kind of things. And so once again, going back to like what I mentioned with that passage is like, if you feel convicted to not drink or whatever, to not get tattoos, to not watch secular TV or any of that kind of stuff, like I think then that just needs to be your conviction, whether or not everyone in the world has a tattoo or everyone in the world is watching a certain show, then like you just need to stick to that and be willing to be the weird person and have your reasoning for it and be willing to explain it away. Um, and same thing, if you're convicted to not have a tattoo and suddenly tattoos become like not a thing anymore and every tattoo parlor goes out of business because suddenly the culture decides we're not getting tattoos anymore, then fine, now you fall in line with the culture, but you didn't do it because you fell in line with the
Yeah.
culture. You did it because of a personal conviction and something that you hashed out with God and things like that. That's where I just feel like it's like whether you drink or not, fine, I guess, as long as like Austin mentioned, there's wisdom on both sides. Like if you want to drink and you want to have a glass of wine at dinner or at a wedding or something, as long as you're not getting drunk and that kind of stuff, I think that's fine. But you need to be fine in your conviction on that, regardless of if the culture drinks in that time or not.
And I think for
I think that's where
me,
I think a lot of people just kind of stop right at that level, like they either have their conviction or they even just be like, it's fine, everyone's doing it, but they don't go to that next step or
yeah.
that next level of like explaining why or like understanding why they have that conviction. Um, yeah.
And I think the other big thing too, I know that we have to wrap up just because Jacob has to leave, but this is my last point is still having grace for people,
Mm,
because I think that that's something that we just sorely miss right now, is that
yes.
people are so quick to just be divided and to argue and to not to hear people out and to cancel people, and that with a lot of these things, right, like tattoos or drinking, the scriptures, there is an argument to be made on both sides.
Sure.
um like, is watching TV a sin? Probably not, but probably
There are probably
yes.
certain shows on there. Yeah, yeah.
Or maybe it is, and
Yeah.
like, and you're not using your time well. And I think that we need to have grace for each other when we have differing convictions, because
Hmm.
we come from different backgrounds, and like, we should
Or
really
even
focus.
differing levels of convictions. Someone may say, it's okay to drink and but it's only okay to drink one glass of wine a day, and someone else would say it's okay to drink but it's okay to drink two glasses of wine a day. So
Or some people might
the
just be
base
like,
level they both say it's okay to drink, but then their degree of that is different.
but I think we should, with these things, we should strive to love each other above those things, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you're going to divide your community or yourself over something like communion, or, you know, or alcohol use or a tattoo, like, we should really consider, like are we putting that above other people,
Mm,
right? And I think that that is important to consider, right? That Paul and the early church was concerned about unity, and I think right now that should be our concern too.
yeah.
And that kind of goes back to, like, becoming like a thick community that has kind of a, in a world that has no community.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well,
That's it.
that's a good closing point for this. And yeah, maybe we'll see you all in a few weeks here at George Fox University. Maybe we won't. If not, we'll you'll catch us again in August. See ya.
See ya.
Once again, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to share it with others. Please rate and review the podcast so others can find it.